You know, I love these readings. I'm sure you all have favorite scripture texts. I certainly do. The thing is, two of my special favorites appear as this week's epistle and gospel. I mean, look at this. Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love God does not know God, for God is love. Those who say, I love God and hate their brothers and sisters are liars, for those who do not love a brother or a sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. That's from 1 John. Isn't it marvelous? Now look what it says in John's gospel. Jesus said to his disciples, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. I cherish both these passages. I love them individually. I love them even more together. That's because when you read them one after the other, you get a truly amazing picture of just how God works in the world. Together they tell us this, that God is love, and that we are connected to God through that love, and through God connected to everyone else. It's an incredible claim, astonishing in fact, and yet it's true. I believe that it's quite literally true. Through God, who is love, we're connected to everyone else. I've always believed this, but some time ago, I had an experience that really brought it home to me. It all began a couple of years back. The thing is, I like to walk. I walk at least 6 miles a day. I have for years. The trouble is, I lived 22 years in Boston and got used to walking in crowded city streets where it became my habit to ignore all the people around me. I reached a point where I could walk for hours and pass literally thousands of people and not notice a single one. Then I moved to Mountain View. Now when I walk, I may pass maybe one person every 5 minutes. And yet I still ignore them. Slowly it occurred to me that this was not a good thing. So I started a little practice. As soon as I spot someone in the distance, I briefly study them to get a picture of them into my mind. Then I look away so it won't seem like I'm staring at them. And I begin to pray for them. I try to imagine their life and ask God to bless them. I ask God to comfort them, to support them, to draw them into God's loving embrace. I continue like this until we pass each other. Then I look over and nod to them, or smile, or say hello, depending on how I feel. The thing is that after doing this for a few weeks, I began to notice something strange. Often when I looked over them, I discovered that they were already looking at me. They were eyeing me with puzzled expressions on their faces, almost as if they knew that I was thinking about them. But I thought, that can't be right. There's no way that they could know that what was on my mind, right? I was quite certain of that. Then something else happened that made me question my certainty about this. It occurred, of all places, in the checkout line at the supermarket. not a spot where I generally expect divine revelation. What happened was this. I'd gone to Nob Hill to buy a few groceries, feeling very rushed. I needed to get home, and I was running late. I practically jogged as I pushed my cart through the aisles. I was doing pretty well too, until I got to that checkout line. I could only seat 2 registers open. Both were backed up with cart after cart after cart. I remember just stopping and glaring at those carts. Just then, though, I noticed that there was actually a 3rd register open. Not only that, but it only had 1 woman in line. Saved, I thought. I jumped to grab the spot before anyone else noticed that the line with only 1 woman and rushed over to fill in the places. I did notice that the woman ahead of me had 2 carts. But if I hesitated at all, it was just for an instant. So what if she has 2 carts, I remember thinking. It's still just 2 carts. How long could it take? I soon found out how long it could take. As it turned out, the reason the woman had 2 carts was that she was sorting through everything in 1 cart and trying to decide what to keep. She was going one by one through each item in her first cart. Sometimes she'd put it on the belt to be paid for. At other times, she'd slowly lower it into the second cart. These apparently were to be returned. All this took long enough because she was not moving quickly. What made it take even longer, though, was the fact that she kept changing her mind. She'd no sooner place an item on the checkout belt than she'd snatch it away again and place it in the cart to be returned, only to hesitate once more and put it back on the belt again. She repeated this over and over again. Throughout all this, the woman was turned completely away from me. I found myself staring at her back with mounting frustration. Again and again, I glanced at my watch. Meanwhile, the 2 lines that had seemed so hopelessly long before were moving ahead at a steady pace. I considered joining them, but every time I did, several more carts would suddenly appear, making me feel that I was better off where I was. I was rapidly approaching meltdown when it suddenly occurred to me just how absurd all this was. I mean, here I was, directing all this silent impatience at this woman. It certainly wasn't making the line move any faster. All I was doing was turning me into a simmering crockpot of frustration. So I stopped. I closed my eyes and took several deep breaths. Gradually, I grew calmer. Eventually, I decided that what I really needed to do now was pray for this woman the way I had done for those people when I walked. I still had my eyes closed, but I tried to picture her. The trouble is, I'd never actually seen her face. She'd had her back to me the whole time. Still, the picture I had of her I had a picture of her in my mind, the image of her hunched forward, bending over her carts. And I held that before me and asked God to be with her, to bless her. I asked God to embrace her, to care for her, to make God's presence known to her. As I did this, I felt my irritation and impatience rapidly evaporate. I grew more and more peaceful. It was at that point, though, that something very strange began to happen. Little by little, I became aware of a growing connection with the woman. I still had my eyes closed, but I could hear the clang and clatter as she continued to move things from cart to conveyor belt and back to the cart again. Only now, more and more, I had an uncanny sense that it was not just she that was doing this. Suddenly, I could actually feel her trying to decide which item to keep and which to put back. I could feel her uncertainty, her doubt, her resolution. Those feelings were now my feelings too. I have no explanation for this. It was as if a door had suddenly opened between us, a door that most of the time we keep tightly locked, the door that allows us to believe that we're all completely separate human beings. With that door now open, I felt her emotions wash over me in waves. The first wave was her confusion. Immediately behind that was her turmoil. Underlying both of these, though, I felt a sadness, a deep, deep sadness. And in that instant, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was a woman confronting the pain of trying to buy food for her family without enough money to do so. Perhaps that should have been obvious to me, but until then, it had not been. Almost at once, however, I received from her an even more profound emotion. I sensed in her a grief so deep that it seemed to rise from the earth itself. I realized that this was also a woman who had recently experienced a terrible loss. What was it? Had she lost her job? Had her husband deserted her? Had he recently died? Had someone else been taken from her? I had no idea. But the force of the pain I felt from her just then was so intense that suddenly I found myself fighting back tears. That was when I opened my eyes. Again, I found myself staring at the woman's back, this woman whose face I had never even seen yet. Even so, her inner world had, for some strange reason, suddenly been opened up to me. I noticed that she was no longer moving the items in her cart. Now she stood completely still. It appeared, in fact, she appeared, in fact, like someone listening to a far-off voice. Very slowly, then, she turned around and looked at me. What you have to realize is that she had no reason even to know that I was there. I'd been standing several feet behind her and hadn't said a word. And yet when she turned, it was like someone who had been tapped on the shoulder. She pivoted full around and gazed directly at me. She had the strangest look on her face. You know, don't you? Her expression said to me as clearly as any words. You know my pain. Mind you, she never said this aloud. And yet the words were unmistakable, conveyed entirely through her look. I have no idea how I did it, but somehow I answered her the same way. Yes, I do, I responded silently. I do know, and I'm very, very sorry. She stared at me a moment longer, then nodded slightly and looked away. For the briefest instant then, I thought that maybe I had imagined it. Almost at once, though, she looked back at me, only now her eyes were filled with tears. Holding my gaze, she nodded a second time, then quickly turned around again. With her back towards me once more, I watched as she brushed her cheeks with the back of her hand. Not long after that, I discovered a book by a brilliant biologist named Rupert Sheldrake, named The Sense of Being Stared At. In it, he discovered that the majority of us believe that we have sensed people staring at us when our backs are turned. and that 60% of us claim to have experienced telepathy. My experience in the checkout line has revealed examples of both of these. Based on his research, Sheldrake concludes that we human beings have not just a sixth sense, but what he calls a seventh sense, a spiritual awareness that connects us to each other, connects us to the world, and connects us to the realm of the spirit. It's true, you know. Based on my own experience, I'm now convinced it's true. I'm convinced that we are all connected in far, far more ways than we let ourselves believe. Perhaps you've had an experience of picking up the phone to call someone only to have the phone ring and find that it was the person you were just dialing. Or perhaps you've had an uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong with someone you love who lives far away, only to find out later that they had been hurt or in trouble. There are those of us who take such things seriously and those who don't. But today's reading suggests that they are indeed very real. We are all connected. We are all connected through love. And love at its most basic is just this. Love is wishing the best for someone. The more we do that, the more intertwined we are, the more intertwined we become. That's because the more we love, the more we abide in God. And God is the great connector. God is love. Whenever we abide in God, God abides in us. Jesus is the vine. We are the branches. We are all connected. What happens to one happens to all. Through God, we are all one. Amen.